This is the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Podcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with my co-host, Katya Gorecki. How's it going, Katya?
You actually pronounced my name correctly, I think, for the first time.
Do you want me to say it wrong? Katya.
No. Nope.
I'm trying.
Nope. I know we've talked about this before. I know you just have a thing. It's fine. It's fine.
It's an accent problem.
I know.
I think it's horrible that you are disparaging the fine people of Cuyahoga County in Cleveland.
I appreciate that you're working on your Russian pronunciation. I honor this. I think it's great.
I have 3 degrees in English and I can't say words.
I mean, to be fair, I work at a university and most of my colleagues, like my entire carear, have not been able to pronounce my name, which is odd because I don't think it's that hard of a name to pronounce, but you never know.
My name's 1 syllable and 3 letters. That's I think
as long as we don't get into like people calling me Kat, we're good.
I actually have people who do sometimes pronounce my name wrong. They'll say Maeve, which I'm like, why? Where does that even? My niece used to say Mauve and I'm like, really?
Interesting.
I don't understand. But anyway, a weird conversation about names. That's not how we usually start the show. Anyway, what are we talking about today? This is your topic.
Basically, I wanted an excuse to talk about what I've been doing in VR. So recently, I was very lucky in that my employer decided I needed to have an Oculus headset.
I want to work there.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it's on the company account, so I can't buy anything. So I'm very limited to what's freely available. Also, Oculus is not my favorite company because it's Facebook, and Facebook security / general use of data is a thing I have feels about, which we'll talk about later.
But if they would like to sponsor us, they're welcome to. Right? Just saying. I'm willing to sell my soul. I'm very poor. There's a pandemic going on.
Okay, fair. You might be. We'll have to have a conversation about that in the distant future when this podcast is monetized. But basically, we've been testing out various like virtual reality, like co-working platforms and like event spaces specifically to combat what I would call like workplace ennui. Which basically is just people struggling with the fact of like working in a remote office. Like my office was never designed to be remote, and I think generally like prides itself on having a really good work culture, which is hard to translate to a virtual environment. And we've all heard at this point of the concept of Zoom fatigue, and I think people are just generally burned out by the general tools that we've been using to kind of continue business as usual. So one of the questions I was kind of thinking about is, are these VR platforms, the one that I specifically talked about on the blog, Altspace, a real solution to that? And my initial like experience playing around with them with my coworkers is maybe.
Okay. So this is a little different. It's a little technology. It's still pop culture, still what we do, but a little more technology-ish than, funny books or movies. So we got a guest. We got what I think is a very interesting guest. I'd like to welcome to the show Caitlyn Meeks. Hi, Caitlyn.
Hi. Thank you so much, Maeve and Kat.
Oh, you're going to fit in well.
We'll allow you just this once. It's loud.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Just so people know, tell the audience what you do and why we felt, well, this is someone who's much more of an expert than we are. So what do you do?
Well, so I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tivoli Cloud VR. and we're making a virtual reality platform that allows a lot of people to come into the same space at the same time and do a lot of things together in a way that like feels really natural. So our emphasis is on kind of like a sense of presence and capturing all the subtlety of body language and the way your voice travels in space. So kind of like you'd mentioned that you were looking at alt space. Mm-hmm. We're sort of experimenting with that idea, but really taking it to a much more nuanced level where you really feel like you're there. And it doesn't feel so much like you're in kind of a cartoon world.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
So you actually know stuff, which is going to be fun because we're going to make stuff up. So.
Hey, I have a degree in VR, dude.
I know.
No, I think. Well, and actually, I was playing around with Tivoli, like the Tivoli Cloud like platform a little bit, mm-hmm. and I do think it's an interesting one on a couple of levels. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, which I don't think is true of a lot of similar platforms that I've seen, is yours is completely open. Like people can mm-hmm. add their own assets to it. Is that correct?
Yeah. This is a huge difference between Tivoli and a lot of the other VR platforms out there. The majority are closed source, and a lot of them are made with like game engines, right. like Unity. And I used to work for Unity, and I love Unity. But the problem is that you can't really like crack that nut open and get down to the very meat of it to optimize it to work well in like a multi-user virtual reality kind of context. So with Tivoli, you really have access to the very heart of this engine, and everything there can be changed and customized and optimized and modified. And in the same way that like Linux is open mm-hmm. source, and you have all of these like flavors of Linux that basically power the internet, and each one has its own kind of like strength. This like versatility of things that the different Linux implementations can do is thanks to it being open source and thanks to the contributions of all of these passionate and brainy people who really like either for money or for love or both put their hearts into making it better. So we really feel that for something that isn't just like a novelty that you play today, instead of, making a little kind of a chat game, we want this to be something that people are using 5 years and 10 years down the road with continuity so that it grows and becomes something way cooler than it even is now. And this is the way out of that trap. This is right. Open source is the way to grow.
So I think that kind of connects back to something I've been thinking about this episode. So for those folks who checked out the blog, one of the things I highlighted is sort of this like what tools are good for what, especially when you're trying to like build human connection and something that feels, I think Caitlyn, you used that word, like something that feels natural. Because Zoom is really useful as a tool for certain like workspace things, but Zoom doesn't feel natural. And there's a lot of like emerging psychological research, or at least speculation, that suggests that part of why we feel burned out and frankly like exhausted and kind of cranky after a day of Zoom calls is because those interactions aren't natural. Like we're not used to staring at a like one-on-one close-up photo, basically moving photo of our coworkers, let alone the video footage of ourselves. Like I know one of the suggestions is always to turn off your own video camera. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if So basically one of the things that, at least in my experience, I think VR, these like embodied, which I mean by embodied, I mean like you can have an avatar that can move around space rather than just like a more static image. If the reason that feels more okay is that sense, that increased sense of naturalness, and then B, what do we actually mean when something feels natural or normal? Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the things I think about is a lot, we've talked about in previous shows, is like when we're talking about naturalness in a platform, or like what feels normal, quote unquote, is like, does that seem, Caitlyn, like an appropriate way to think about it? Like, I guess basically the question is, should we be trying to replicate what feels like everyday lived experience, or should we be trying to find find something different in VR or any other kind of remote or virtual experience?
Well, the same way we kind of like breathe air and look at things around us, and that feels natural. Like we similarly have like a natural way that we talk to other people. And, like talking to you guys over here over voice, I can't see you, but through hearing you, I can hear your laughs. I can hear doubt. I can hear all of these different sort of like textures about your intent. And that's where there's like kind of a subtlety, and that's where there's nature. And if I could see you, and if I could see your hands moving, and like if you were slumping forward or standing tall, I could also interpret that to get a better idea of like how you're feeling. And in that sense, like there's just kind of this natural sort of way we talk and this natural kind of dance that we do when we're interacting together in space. And so to me, it's important to capture that, like that nuance. And you can't really get a lot of this through like a video chat call, especially like the body language,
Right.
So this kind of naturalness is important, but you could take that and put it in a context that is completely alien or fantastical or whimsical, and have conversations that, like are non-Euclidean spaces, or, so it's possible to have both. But in order to like not let the technology get in the way, you need to have this kind of subtlety. So if I were to like walk up to you in VR in Tivoli and kind of whisper into your ear, it would feel very natural to you because it has kind of that like chilling effect that someone is invading your personal space just a little bit. And maybe the whisper gives you kind of that ASMR sort of spookiness, and that all comes through. Because if you look at like kind of like at Altspace or VR Chat, which are lovely virtual worlds, the audio tends to just kind of be full blast.
Yeah.
And it's like you're listening to the radio or something, and everyone's like a CB radio,
Yes.
Yeah.
With Tivoli, it's very nuanced. So, you could be at a dance floor and the music is pulsing when you're on the floor, but then you step off to the corner with someone and have a quiet conversation. So that's sort of like nature. Like that just makes such a massive difference because people are the most important content,
Well, and it's functional too. One of the things I found really intriguing about Altspace is like you could only, which sounds like it's even more true of Tivoli, is that like when we were having large group gatherings, you could only really hear the people that were like immediately around you in that virtual space. You weren't hearing people that were 20 feet away, which is different from like a Zoom call. Because that's one of the things we've had is like, how do you transition, say like, the office happy hour or like a communal gathering to VR? Because that's kind of why we were looking at all these event platforms, because an office social call on Zoom is not only not very social, it's in some cases very exhausting. Yeah. Because you feel like you constantly are battling to talk when there's 35 people in the room.
In a way that you don't in a real life conversation, if and maybe it's one of the flaws with our show is that we've always said we treat this like it's a bar conversation. So we'll talk over each other sometimes. And when I'm editing, I just leave it because that's the flow of our show, but it's not how an interview show normally goes. Right. And I was thinking, I recently went to, COVID times being what they are. I went to a birthday party on Topia, which has this similar feature. You can hear people better the closer they are to you in the virtual space. So it's weird because I've done a bunch of dinner parties and stuff on Zoom, just as we all have in the last 9 months. And hell, I do this show every week, which we've been doing for 2 years, almost 3, where we're just talking to each other. Yeah, I know. But we're just talking to each other online, but it is all communal. But when I go to in the before times, in the long ago, when we used to have actual happy hours, I'd go to a work happy hour and it's me and 20 of my coworkers. and there are 8 conversations going on at a time, right? But each one has 2 or 3 people. You just have you're at different tables, and that's fine. And so in a way, it sounds like Caitlyn, what you're trying to do is you're not trying to replicate, or you're not trying to make the Zoom world better, right? The Zoom world is all about trying to, how can we connect everybody for, it's a very work oriented app. Everybody's using it for social needs because we have to. But the entire point of Zoom is to have a meeting. You're trying to replicate. You're trying to replicate more a virtual space.
Well, it's replicating human interaction.
Yes.
In a way that Zoom, I think, was never intended to. At least that's what that would at least be how I would describe it.
Talking about the idea of replicating a space. This actually brings to mind something kind of interesting that's happening right now with Tivoli. Because space has context. When you're in a Zoom call, it could be a business meeting, or it could be a call with, a family member, and they're always going to see you in your living room.
I'm in the Death Star. Thank you very much.
Or in your basement Death Star, or but they're always going to see you usually in the same space. And so there's no context for what when you're in a bar, you realize I'm in a bar. I'm going to have a drink. I'm going to relax. The atmosphere, says kind of sets your tone. If you're in a classroom, you're aware of this and you behave differently than if you were in a bar. If you're in the library, if you're in the supermarket. And so context is really important. We read that and it defines how we communicate. And we have, there's a university in Vancouver, Simon Fraser University, and they approached us because they wanted to experiment with teaching their lectures in VR. Because the majority of universities out there, they're using, I believe, Zoom. Yeah, they're using Zoom for most of their courses. And a professor there, Jeremy Turner, wanted to try using Tivoli. So we kind of did this as sort of a pilot, and we created a lecture hall, a space that is just, a reproduction of a classic lecture hall. And it's got the 4-paneled chalkboard that slides up and the little ladder you move around. And it's got, the chairs.
Oh, you think people will care way more about me than the lecture halls that I actually get to use?
Maybe
I don't get those cool.
It sounds like this guy is very fortunate.
Yes. Classroom space. As a teacher, I get a whiteboard. Maybe I'm I'll use that. Okay.
See, in VR, awesome. In VR, maybe we can value our teachers more and give them better space.
That's true.
I have VR tenure. That'd be neat.
I mean, the interesting thing about this, though, is really the person who wanted to do this was the professor, because he said he was just tired of teaching from his living room. And he's like, I don't want people to see I have a low rent apartment that's all messy. He's like a brainiac, and he just books everywhere and his place is crazy. And he's like, I miss having a lecture hall. And so he actually looked out to do this for his own comfort in presenting, because he was always a big VR fan and VR user, and his work kind of borders into VR as a cognitive scientist.
That's really interesting.
And so we did this, and we're still running their 2 Cognitive Science 100 courses in Tivoli twice a week.
So how do they connect? So just for the listener, how do they connect? I mean, are you talking a platform where people are looking in a window, or are they looking on headsets? How's it working?
Yeah, well, 3 different ways. So the instructor, he likes to wear a VR headset, and he has an avatar of himself that looks professional, well-dressed. His hair is always nice. So you can't tell he's wearing filthy sweatpants. Sorry, Jeremy. He looks consistently professorial. So he likes to teach from his VR headset.
Okay.
And so when he's in front of the class and he's talking, he's moving his hands around, and his avatar hands are moving and matching his movement. And then we've got this really lovely system we call Tivoli Shared Desktop, which is kind of like it's kind of like screen sharing, but you're doing it on a virtual computer in the cloud. And so he throws up all of his slides and everything on there, and videos and course materials. He's got kind of a control panel in front of him that he can use to like swipe through the slides, all from in VR. And then some students who are like a little more technically savvy, they come in virtual reality and attend the class. A lot of students don't, though, have VR headsets because it's still kind of an exotic technology.
Yeah, kind of expensive.
I did an entire dissertation on the history of VR, and I never used, like, I only ever borrowed headsets because they're just like, in some cases, they're very expensive.
They are, yeah, and they take time, and it's like you have to get used to it. So what we've also done is students can also come in desktop mode and kind of park an avatar in the classroom and watch from their screen. And then for people who are on the go or something, they can also watch the lecture being streamed up onto Twitch, which makes it accessible to everyone.
Oh, okay.
And so then we sort of like routed the Twitch chat into the world. So if you're one of the students in Twitch and you're like, hey, is the test on Thursday?
So theoretically, you'd be able to attend without, I was going to say without any special technology. I guess Twitch is technology that you wouldn't necessarily have, but clearly anyone can download it.
Yeah.
Like you could,
right.
You don't need specialized hardware.
The average university student,
right?
Like you probably, like most university courses require you to have you're required to have a computer and internet connection, especially in this current remote setting. So by virtue of those two things, you have access to Twitch.
You have it on your cell phone, if nothing else. You can.
Sure, that's true, actually. That's really cool. So, I could totally see. I know I did a workshop in the beginning of quarantine that was entirely on Zoom, and I understand the idea of like lecturing being really unsatisfying through Zoom.
Oh yeah,
because I think that the weird thing that I don't think most people understand until you start teaching is how much teaching is about performance. So the same way we talk about like comedians thriving on audience feedback, like teaching is not always as humorous as the average comedian. There are exceptions.
Speak for yourself. Okay.
I said there are exceptions.
Okay. All right.
Just calm yourself, sir.
Hello to all my students.
Also, if you're one of those students, please let us know. I just want to know if Mav's students actually listen to this. I'm just morbidly curious.
We've had my students on this show before.
I know, but did they listen to it beforehand?
I don't know. I don't know.
Anyway, but like audience feedback is really important. So and also just like lecturing for me, it was always like a very embodied experience. Like teaching in a seated position for me is completely unnatural. And I'm someone who gesticulates wildly. I have accidentally hit, thankfully not a student, but a teaching a coworker. Not hard, but I just gestured very widely and then smacked them in the face, which my students found very delightful. And I'm sure somewhere someone has posted it to make fun of teaching faculty. But see, I could do that in VR, whereas Zoom, I can't do that. But I'm also wondering, like, especially for those students who are able to join either through desktop or VR, where they have an avatar, like, is there an approximation of that kind of like audience feedback in this instructor's experience?
Well, this is the thing. And Dr. Turner himself has said this is one of the things he really loves is he's standing there, he's lecturing. He teaches standing up. So he's using like a Vive, which has room space. So he can kind of like pace around in front of his podium. And I think like when you're talking and you're pacing, you actually kind of think a little differently, when you can gesture with your hands. But he can see when there's students sitting in the class, and he really likes that, and if students in VR, they can raise their hand. And we're looking at ways to make it even easier for people who aren't in world to be able to like kind of communicate more easily with the instructor beyond just like Twitch text chat. So yeah, the instructor loves it. He puts on the headset and kind of forgets that he's in his house. He's at the university. He's teaching.
See, that sounds great to me because this is a problem that I have right now teaching. One of the biggest flaws for me has been that the technology level, even on a very basic sense, I don't have a VR headset, but I have Fios internet coming to my home, which makes my net connection relatively fast. Not all my students necessarily have that. So sometimes even in a Zoom class, there will be varying level of technology. I have students who cannot adequately stream video and watch my video at the same time. So they just don't have their cameras on, which means that sometimes, and they just can't, because they're literally, they're on like slow DSL and they can't hear me if they're broadcasting. So they'll just have, it's just black boxes, and it really does screw up your teaching dynamic. I am so jealous of his ability. Even if I was looking at just blank people, like people without emotions, like if there was just a body there to stare at, that really does change the entire way you speak. It's probably easier for me than it is for some teachers because I do this show every week, and we don't usually use video just because we don't. But this is very conversational in a way that teaching isn't. Teaching is call and response in a much, not always. It depends on the kind of class. Sometimes I might have a class which is a very open dialogue, but often when you're lecturing, I need to be able to see who I'm performing to, and it really is performance, like Katya said. I imagine it's the equivalent of, and I've seen a couple of comedians doing stand-up sets to Zoom since this started, and they're awful. And comedians that I like, they're just not. Yeah. It's not awful. Like, the jokes are still funny, but the vibe of it is so weird because you're looking at somebody who's practiced at speaking to an audience that, he can see laugh.
It's a completely different context. It's I think both for the person who's performing, because they're not getting the audience feedback, but also for the people who are listening. Like, even if that example, like a comedian's putting in a laugh track, they
can tell the difference because they react differently to a laugh track than, with Katya, I recognize your image from alt space as you, but it's not realistic because that would be distracting. And now there are some parts of it, the alt space avatars, I find it really creepy that they have hands but no arms. That weirds me out.
And no legs.
and no legs. Yeah. So, but you're not.
It's like disembodied, like bowling pins.
So it's not the artistic choice that I would have picked, but it's fine because. Or you posted a picture of our scoreboard images from last week, right? Like, if we go back a few episodes, and if I remember, I'll put it in the show notes. We did a show on like cartoons versus avatars, and I'm not trying to trick people into thinking this is the photorealistic me, right? Like when I physically draw myself into my old comic strip, I don't want you to think it's the real me. I'm making it silly. I'm making it simple because it's an idea. It's an expression. And I think a lot of it's you don't have in any of these platforms. If we went full photorealism, we'd hit an uncanny valley issue. We're not looking for that. We're looking for the fun aspect, kind of. You're looking for something that's expressive and it's different.
Yeah, it's the fun aspect, and I think it's also, and this is why I think the idea of realism, and I use the word real and realism all the time in my research, almost always in air quotes, because what real means to people is vastly different depending on cultural context, basically, and all kinds of things. And I think like what we're talking about in this case is realism in this sense doesn't mean, by which I mean realism in the sense of what feels meaningful about an experience has nothing to do with how much it's replicating, IRL kind of interaction.
It's so true. Yeah.
Right. It's like, how is the experience I'm having in this virtual context replicating what I want out of this experience socially, artistically, or what have you. So it's, I think one of my frustrations, I remember building that avatar, and it was just like, I find like avatar recreation, or like design interfaces really fascinating in like video games and in platforms like this, because I almost always find it a frustrating experience for different reasons. Because on the one hand, this was frustrating because it was like, and one of my coworkers commented on this, and he basically said like all the body types look the same. He's like, I can't make a character that looks like me. And so there's a representation aspect, also like skin tone colors and all that other stuff. I know like, which comes up in every video game, that they're not very realistic, especially when you get to the not white people in a lot of contexts. And that frustration being like, I can't represent my identity, not necessarily like to be realistic and true to my current self. Like actually the avatar you're talking about, Mav, I remember mentioning to my coworkers, this is what I look like pre-pandemic? Because it's the haircut I almost always have, but I haven't had my haircut since March.
Right.
And so in my mind, this is what I look like, which was a really interesting experience for my coworkers because so I started my job remotely. They've never actually met me.
Yeah.
And so the person that they see on Zoom every day and this avatar in some ways, it's like if you put them together, that's probably the closest, at least visual representation to what I would look like during, I think, like we always recall to them is the long before times, which I think is and I think that's an interesting practice. It's sort of like what it means to be who we look like or be who we are when we have full control.
Well, it's also, there's a weird performative thing. My icons, my avatars, whether I'm drawing myself with just a pencil or even, again, looking at the scoreboard thing with the little emoji S's from last week. My pictures of myself have a very specific goatee, that I've not had since like March because shaving was a thing for the before times. So like I don't shave anywhere near as regularly as I used to because even the once a week that I teach in person, because I've got like like weird hybrid type stuff that I have to do, like I'm wearing a mask now. So like
Sure.
I've got way more beard than I normally have. and like when this is all over, we'll have to reevaluate, what my look is. But you're right. Right. Like, I have an avatar that wears my glasses, but I never use it for anything because I don't like in my head.
It doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't feel like a representation of you that you want to use in that context.
Right. So there is a weird, there's a weird performance to it that I think is interesting. And this is where,
who are you performing for?
Well, that's exactly what I want to get to.
Because I think the avatar creation is like in a video game, for example, like who are you making that avatar for? So like if I'm playing Fallout,
I was gonna say Warcraft,
and I make an elaborate recreation of who I would like to look like, what I would like to look like in a post-apocalyptic retrofuturism, which by the way, retrofuturism is entirely my aesthetic. So I get very deep into this. I basically want to live in Blade Runner with less fascism and pollution and just basically the Blade Runner aesthetic without the gross stuff. Can we, as a reminder to listeners, eugenics bad. Eugenics bad. Sorry, that's one of our. We have several running jokes. Caitlyn, eugenics bad is.
I like that.
I want a eugenics bad t-shirt.
I'm going to agree with you on that point. Yeah.
It's one of those things, especially like I wonder what people's reactions would be if I walk around in the world with a eugenics bad t-shirt. I just want to know as a social experiment. Anyway, like I think the avatar creation, because I think we think of as an avatar, like we're trained to think of an avatar in social media context as a thing you use to identify yourself with other people. But I think actually what's more important is your avatar, I think, is more importantly performance for yourself.
Caitlyn, you mentioned that professor,
because when you're making
you mentioned a professor and you said his hair is always perfect, right? Like if I start using your platform for teaching, I'm going to have just because I know exactly what I do. I would put my glasses on, and I would also, because I want to be professional, I'd probably add gray temples, which I do not have, but and elbow patches on my jacket, absolutely, because that's what professors look like, and that's who I want to be. But like,
so funny. So
one of the first pieces of advice I got when I started teaching was somebody told me is to buy a professor jacket, because I am, at the time I was a 22-year-old young woman, and they were like, the more you can look like someone's idea of a teacher, the easier you will have a time.
I actually have a professor jacket.
As a teacher.
It doesn't have patches on the elbows, but it does. Have you ever seen me wear my professor jacket? It's a hoodie. I have a professor jacket, but with a hood on it, because I was like, yeah, that's my look. But I don't wear it that much anymore, just because it was like when I first started teaching. I need to get like a collection of them, because they do make one that has elbow patches, and I think I need that.
This is such a really interesting point, and like the idea of having an avatar for like a specific kind of like purpose, like, hey, this is what I'm going to look like when I'm teaching, and then this is what I'm going to look like when I'm with my friends. Yeah, it's just like in real life, you can wear the jacket and get the elbow patches, or wear a hoodie and torn jeans and go out to a bar. like personally, I have like 3 main avatars that I use. And when I'm helping the university at Simon Fraser University, I've got like very tidy human avatar. Like, okay, I've got pink hair, but like pretty real, kind, like non-offensive kind of humanoid looking. But then when I'm on my own and goofing around or working, I usually wear this avatar that's kind of like a pink and purple sort of berry thing, and like which I just am personally attached to. But I wouldn't wear this to the university because it just wouldn't fit the context.
I like how you say wearing the avatar. That is a perfect way of saying it.
It's like an outfit. And then, but this is the funniest thing is I've got a Goose avatar, just like I was inspired by this game called Untitled Goose Game, which is out there where you basically in this game you play a goose and you run around and just be awful and like harass people, and you know how geese can be. They're very stubborn and aggressive, but at the same time you're like, what are you doing? Why are you coming at me? And when I wear this avatar, I kind of just sort of, you've got a button you can push to honk, and I'll just run around and start honking and kind of not giving a fuck about who's around me or anything. And it's just this whole other side of me just comes out. And depending on the avatar you're wearing, you can kind of assume different personalities or let different sides of yourself out.
Well, it reminds me of the scene where they're dressing up in Ready Player One, where, even though they're in their virtual selves to begin with, but then how do I customize my virtual self for this virtual event that I'm, that I'm doing? It is and you're not limited. Like in real life, if I want to look different, I'm limited to maybe I put on a different outfit. Maybe I do my hair differently, add or subtract makeup, there's only so many things I can do, right? Like I can't just decide to be 50 pounds heavier or lighter today, right? I can work towards that, but I can't just decide today to do that. But in a virtual space, I can. If I want to, if I want wings, then I sprout wings, right? If I, like that is a thing that is a thing that like I have the option for, or I have the options that the programmers have given me, right? Like so.
Well, and if you're the programmer, you have virtually unlimited options.
Modular time, sure, yeah.
Or if you know the programmer and can provide that. Well, that's like Mav, you were just talking, and I was thinking actually one of my favorite novels about virtual reality is Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. And one of the premises is basically, and I think that I find this novel interesting because I think it's a much more, to me, meaningful way of thinking about what's real and what's not about VR and similar platforms. And it's again about that idea of like what is real is what's meaningful. Because hero protagonist, who has the best name in all of literature, like the novel portrays his experience as if his time in the virtual reality system is his real life. But it's not because somehow like VR has taken over his existence in a way he doesn't understand the difference between reality and fiction anymore. Quite the opposite is he actually, one, understands that VR is a continuation of his experience, and two, because he's a programmer that basically in this universe kind of invented a lot of aspects of the virtual space, he has almost unlimited power to create himself. Whereas like in the quote unquote real world, physical world, whatever you want to call it, he lives in a shipping container and like is pretty like struggling in life. In VR, like he has his motorcycle, he has his katana, he is Japanese and basically does this whole samurai thing. And he has full control over like what he looks like, where he is, and autonomy in a way that's not being defined by socioeconomic status, location, and all these other things. And I think that there's a potential. There are drawbacks to that.
Well, since we have Caitlyn, I want to ask a question then, because so you're doing this work for real, whereas for us, it's either playing with it or, I've watched a lot of movies. I played Shadowrun. I've played a lot of video games, right? So there's and Katya, for what you were just saying, meat space, that is the real world. But like one of the things that I find interesting is, there's been, I'm not even going to say with just VR, even with Zoom, that everybody was just suddenly forced into Zoom Zoom at the beginning of this year, right? Like just for lack of options, it just happened rapidly. And I think there was a rejection of it because of that. But then I want to compare this to, I remember, I'm old enough to remember the awkwardness of just suddenly starting to communicate more and more with text messaging on phones rather than calling people. It was weird for a minute back in 1998, but like in 2020, fuck it. I don't want to talk to anybody on the phone. Oh God. I guess, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and then it's getting complicated, it's like, I guess call me, fine. But you'd rather type to them, right?
You've just become an honorary millennial, man.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Well, I'm a 14-year-old girl. You know that.
It's okay. I've been a 16-year-old boy since I was born. So
right. So, but like the same thing. I imagine if I were 120, I'd feel this way about the change to suddenly using telephones at all, right? Like from what do you mean telephone? I can just go next door and talk to the person, right? Like there's weirdness of it. And then I think about, now this is where a way in which I'm not, you said millennial. I mean, I'm basically a Zoomer, but one of the ways in which I'm not is I am not the kind of person who can have, like, I know people who have literally started dating and eventually gotten married because they met on WoW, like they don't, like, people have relationships that entirely form over virtual avatars. Now, this was in a video game setting, like, but I know people who've done that, right? Or Fortnite or whatever the video game du jour is of that day, where there are, where people can form entire relationships through avatars because it's natural to them. So I think the Zoom weirdness is just because it was sprung on everybody against our will during the middle of, an already traumatic time. Right. And I think that we will get used to it. So what I'm wondering about is for Caitlyn, what do you see as when you were talking about the different ways you behave depending on which avatar you're wearing, right? Do you see differences in the way in which virtual space relationships develop? Because, like, okay, so this show is based on Katya and I having conversations that we used to have next to each other. Like when we worked together and saw each other every day, we'd have conversations like this every day. And now we live in different states, so we do it over the internet, right? So my relationship with her is different because I knew her in real life before. But do you see a developing weirdness when you meet someone in that virtual space, which you do? People are going to say it's constructed, but it's constructed anyway, right? Because like it's not like Katya ever saw me in my pajamas just crawling out of bed. You saw me at work the way that I decided to look when I went to work. Yeah.
Well, it's also like a newsflash, as we talk on the show all the time. Everything about your experience is constructed, whether by accident or by intention.
If you're having this weird constructed world where hi, I just met my new friend Caitlyn, and for some reason she has a halo at all times, because and angel wings, right, and pink hair. And I don't know if you really have pink hair. I know nothing about you in real space, but does real space matter if virtual space is the important bit?
This is such a great question. I'm really glad you brought this up. In fact, I was kind of hoping you'd go there because this is perfect. So, like you were saying about how text messaging was alien for, like Gen Xers when it first emerged. Like, I can totally relate because this isn't a natural way to communicate. Just like sitting down to write a letter to someone, it's like you have to like set your space. You have to think differently than if you're just talking to that person. But when you get on the phone with someone, it kind of feels natural because it's kind of conversational because you're sort of using your spoken word, faculty to do it. But likewise, like Zoom is kind of weird, right? Video conferencing is kind of weird because you're there, but you're not there. It's kind of just like a fraction of the experience. So with in full immersive VR, like Tivoli, especially where you can have really anything as an avatar, from a photogrammetry generated reproduction of yourself to a little blob that has blobs for arms and a goofy face. If you're in virtual reality and you are moving around, your avatar really manages to convey that sense of presence in a way that is totally natural. So, so regardless of what you're wearing or how you look, like the way you talk and the way you move, all comes through. And so my co-founder, Maki, she's an incredible programmer. We had been working together and meeting mostly in VR because she's in the Canary Islands, where I am now. And I was in San Francisco, where I'm from. And so we spent, hundreds, thousands of hours together in VR as our avatars. Mm-hmm. And we really kind of eat the dog food and use the technology we're developing. Mm-hmm. And when she flew out to San Francisco last year, and we met in person for the first time and we gave each other a big hug, I'm like, you are exactly like your avatar. I mean, you don't look like your avatar necessarily.
Wait a minute, you're not green. But, I was led to be. Right. I was led to believe you were a green person. Yeah.
But I'm like, yeah, I know this person. I know all of her mannerisms. And it was the same thing for her. And we're like completely at ease because we have met each other spatially. And so that combination of voice for that naturalness you might get from a phone call, or like we kind of feel like we're sitting around a bar right now, coupled with that same natural body language in 3D space, it just works regardless of how you look, and it's the most amazing
thing. You think what I hear you say is there's an essence to the person that enters the performance separate from the visual, right? Yeah. Like again, I mean, I'm making jokes about green, or if I decide I want to show up on your platform as a dragon, I can just be a dragon, right? Oh, there's still an essential Mavness about that character that Tivoli can't. Yeah. I mean, I guess if I'm a good actor and I want to catfish somebody, I probably could, but like assuming I'm trying to be myself, then it comes through if I'm a dragon. Okay. So this is a future experiment. Mav, you're gonna show up in VR as a dragon, and we can't know who you are, and then figure out which dragon is Mav. Yeah, there's six dragons, and it's like which one's the real Mav?
I have a feeling it's gonna be red and black, and or red and purple.
Damn it!
And generally very chatty and loud. That would be my at least initial assessment.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm just going to not talk for the next 30 seconds, but I'm not. It's not going to, I'm not going to, never mind. But
I think that's really insightful, example though, because I think I think a lot about what people mean when they say relationships on Facebook or relationships in like online relationships aren't quote unquote real relationships. Mm-hmm. And from a research perspective, there's very little evidence to actually suggest that that's a case. Mm-hmm. I understand why, and I think it goes back, Mav, to what you were talking about. We're not used to these things, right. But for example,
you are now. You are now because you have to be.
I mean, I think what is true is when you go on Facebook and somebody has 10,000 friends, they don't actually have 10,000 friends. They have 10,000 friends that they have interacted with and pushed a button.
They have fans at that point. I mean, followers,
or casual acquaintances, or whatever. On you're the average person on LinkedIn, the thousands of people they might be connected to, they're not probably interacting with those regularly. But as far as our actual friendships, the people we actually spend time with, our interactions might look different than they do in day to day, but there's still have kind of what Caitlyn's talking about. There's still the essence of the person comes through if you have interactions through platforms that you find that are meaningful. I remember recently one of my best friends and I, one of our favorite things to do was to watch TV series together, and basically just talk and be obnoxious with the entire TV series. And so what we now live in 2 different states, and also there's a pandemic going on, so we're not obviously traveling to see each other. And so what we do is just basically put a thing on Netflix, and there's you can now kind of share streaming services through a couple of different apps and watch movies together, and then just put on a phone call and just talk chat the entire time in the same way. And it's not the same as being in the room and being in the room with this person, but it is the essence of that experience in a way that I actually don't know that it would be substantially more fulfilling if we were able to travel right now.
Well, I wonder if it's just different, right? And I don't mean different in a good or a bad way, right? There's a sense of, up until, again, in the before times, I think there was a prioritization of the real, of meat space above the virtual. But I think that's just, inertia and ego, right? Like, it's just, well, my relationship is real because, I mean, I think I'm trying to think of people like who meet over the internet for romantic relationships, right? Like there's always been a stigma of it, of, oh, you met your girlfriend over WoW or over Fortnite. She lives 3,000 miles away. Sure. Like it seems very fake in a way that I don't think has been true in decades at this point. Everyone has been on the internet since like the year 2000. It's been 20 years since like literally most of the planet has access to this. Everyone's got some level of friend that lives outside of their immediate going to visit. Like it's not we haven't lived in a world where you can only be friends with the people in your neighborhood in a long time, right? And now that nobody can do it,
I think, Mav, when you started your comment, you were talking about like this way that we privilege meat space or whatever, or realness over virtual space. And I think while that's true of the Western world, philosophically, as we tend to have a hierarchy of like real, quote unquote, whatever that means to us, is better than virtual. That's not actually true in practice. Like we talk about that, but we don't actually live it. So like, for example, like the scholar Timothy Welsh talks about this as mixed realism, is that actually this whole like separation between real and virtual kind of bullshit.
Right. We say that.
Like actually like everything you're doing on a daily basis in the 21st century involves real things and virtual things. And I think the example he gives that I find the most compelling, because I don't think I recognized it until I thought about it, is banking, which is really mundane. But in the 21st century, you literally cannot experience banking in an entirely analog fashion. It's predicated on the idea that you have virtual aspects of that experience. So whether that's like, even if it's just you don't have the apps or you don't log in and manage your bank account, you're probably still going to an ATM. That's interacting with a virtual interface. That's interacting with something that is not in so-called meat space.
Banks do have real buildings still, don't they?
And even our like,
I would never go to one.
Right. Well, that's the thing, is it's like even the most, I think what we would think of as the most non-virtual, non-digital part of that experience is like, oh, I'm physically going to the bank to get money. It's like, you're probably not going up to the teller. And even if you're getting money from the teller, she's moving your money around in your bank account through a virtual system. Like money itself at this point is virtual. It exists as a bunch of zeros and ones in a system telling you how much money you have. Most money on the planet that we quote unquote have doesn't actually exist. There is not enough print.
I haven't been to an ATM in like 2 years.
I think like it's kind of important to sort of like draw a line between real, virtual, and meaningful.
Absolutely.
Because just because something's virtual, it can be incredibly meaningful and have like real consequences. So like banking, like looking at that number in your bank account, that has actual meaningful differences. And likewise, you could, have a really good friend who you've never met in person, but have an incredibly meaningful relationship. And this is such an interesting like notion. I mean, we've lived like hundreds of thousands of years as a species, like wallowing in mud and eating roots and stuff. Like,
yes,
really, and like, it's just so weird that here we are, just in the last 100 years. My great uncle tells me about how incredible it was to listen to the radio and just listen to like radio shows in the 1930s. And here we are now feeling the presence of people on remote islands, halfway around the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that like, if there's a good thing to come out of all this, it's that I don't know that we're going to go back to a world where we can completely privilege the real over the virtual. Like, I think we'll try, because like, just like people are, whenever the gates are released, people are just going to be like, oh my God, I can hug people. Amazing. So like I can see that. I really believe that there's going to be like, when all pandemics end, there's just going to be like this week where we're just going up and licking strangers. I just like like
the social acceptance of licking people.
I can touch you. It's amazing. And then we're all going to have serious conversations with ourselves about, where our feelings on boundaries and personal space. And so, yes, I understand.
I feel like you've had a very different experience of the pandemic than I have.
I had a tenuous grip on sanity before, remember? So
like, I agree that we're probably not going to have the same experience of like the hierarchy of virtual and real. I don't know that we will have that same kind of backlash effect, because this was a trend that's been happening long before the pandemic.
Right. And that's kind of my real point. Like, are we going to get to this point where it's just normal that most people meet their significant other 3,000 miles away? Are we going? Is Tivoli going to replace Tinder? And I mean that in a very real way, right? Like, Tinder is all about, I want to fuck, so my range is 20 miles. Who's around? Like that's like a thing. And Tivoli. I mean, now if your goal is literally to have sex, then that 20-mile range is kind of important, because you can't
clearly
say
have not seen certain aspects of Second Life.
Well, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. Like, if your goal is physically, literally touching, it becomes tricky. But if your goal is literally to form some kind of relationship, and I'm saying small R relationship, I'm leaving it very open as to whether it is a romantic or sexual or business or just social or, just someone I want to talk about movies with, right? Like, whatever. I think that again, this show only exists. The four of us, Wayne and I are at least in the same city, but we've recorded the show in the same room 4 times ever, 4 or 5 times. Right. You and Hannah were in the same city, but you haven't been since, in 6 months. Right. And this show works because we can do it through virtual space. But I think about it, Katya, you and I only worked together for 1 year. We were only we literally most of our relationship has been virtual, even though we met in real life first.
But I guess that's the thing I want to challenge about the idea that there's going to be, there's always going to be people who I think are going to hold on to a pre-existing part of real is what's important and virtual is not, because that's just backlash against cultural change, which isn't saying it's a good or a bad thing. It just is it's a phenomenon that happens. On the flip side, though, so the idea that virtual, historically, the idea that virtual, specifically in the Western world, means something that's not real is actually historically a fairly recent phenomena. Virtual hasn't always meant false or in some way inferior. That hierarchy has only existed probably for the last, I'd have to go look my research again to know the dates, last 200 years. And I believe it starts to emerge because of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment has this idea that among with a lot of other things, both good and bad, this idea that physical evidence is what tells you what's reality. So from that, you start seeing philosophies and sort of ways of
rejection
knowing
of spirituality,
right? That emphasize what we can physically interact with as what is important, significant, and significant for our experience, both basically to understand what we're dealing with in our daily life. And I think a lot of the 20th and 21st century has been in some ways responding to rediscovering that actually immaterial aspects of our experience are really important. So for example, and a lot of that happens, I think, through technology. So for example, radio is a really good example, because radio, yes, there's material aspects of it and you have an interface, you have the actual physical radio itself, but radio is basically going actually what's important are people's ideas and their voices. That's not an immediately material thing, even though material aspects are involved. So what we value is, in that sense, to just use the term virtual kind of collapse with immaterial, are the immaterial parts of that experience. And I think what we're discovering now through the pandemic, or what we're becoming more familiar with the fact that what we value about our day-to-day experiences are a lot of those intangible, immaterial pieces. I think it's going to be really difficult to justify that hierarchy anymore. I think we've actually had, because this cultural shift was already happening, even just thinking about video games, the fact that people, we don't see the same backlash against video games as a meaningful thing that we did, for example, in the 80s when everyone thought that, video games were going to make people into demons or whatever. We just don't see that. And I think a lot of it is because right now, if you include phone games, especially, over 90% of people in the United States are quote unquote gamers.
On some level or another, yes.
Right. Everyone plays, not everyone, but the vast majority of people play video games. So it's no longer stigmatized. Now that the vast majority of people have used remote work, virtual interfaces to socialize, to do work, to do things, I don't think we're going to see this real virtual split in the same way anymore. Well,
even for just working, and this Caitlyn, this goes back to where this conversation started with the professor you're working with. I mean, I'm a teacher, right? But and before I was a teacher, I designed software. So in both of those situations, 10 years ago, people would have said, well, it's impossible to do this online. You can't outsource this to India because being in person is meanwhile, like when I was a designer, when I was a software designer, I was working with people. I was in Pittsburgh working with people in China routinely, right? Like it just it happens all the time that we're constantly doing video conferencing, or we're doing, we're texting each other or just emailing each other. So there was always that split. And now that we've all been, forced to be locked up inside, there is a very real question of, what are we paying for physical space for, right? Do we need an office ever? I understand why I feel good about having an office, which I totally get why that professor you were talking about feels better teaching in a virtual space than so right now I'm in my studio, which is kind of messy, and I don't want people to see, oh, he's just got random crap hanging up all over the place. No, I want to be on the Death Star, which is why I use that Zoom background, right? but if I'm teaching from being able to teach from the virtual classroom instead of my couch there is an appeal to that, right? And the appeal, part of the appeal, I do think it's different being in person than teaching online, having done both. But I think that one of the fears of the virtual is I don't want people, I don't want people invited into my safe space, my home, in order for me to talk to them because I have to work on a project with them, or I have to teach them. I want to be able to say, no, the world in which I interact with you, student, is this classroom or this office, right? And so to the extent that technology can help me create that space, I think that...
Well, it's mental barriers, basically.
It's mental, and it's also physical and economic barriers. There's all these things that stand in the way of doing what we want to do and being who we want to be, and conducting ourselves in the way we want. And it could be bodily, it could be geographical, you're stuck in a location, or maybe you're in a wheelchair, or maybe you've got incredibly low self-esteem and high social anxiety, or it could be a number of things that are constraints that might hold someone back in the real world, and by kind of lifting that, it just opens up so much more possibility, and I think can make life a lot better. So maybe there's kind of a blessing in disguise here with humanity currently switching to virtual modes of being together, because maybe we'll be able to figure out that this is in some ways more real.
That entirely makes sense. I think and I think this is what I was trying to get at earlier, is that I don't foresee a world in which most people, because there's always people who are not, I understand that there are always people who are not into digital experiences. I get that. Everyone, has different levels of comfort. And I think especially for people who are, I've at least observed, and that people who spend a lot of time, for example, on Twitch streams before, or other forms of digital interactions, have had an easier time, I think, transitioning to remote, just because it's we're used to it. And I think a lot of that being used to it is precisely the idea that we are used to virtual experiences, digital experiences being a meaningful part of our lives. So it doesn't feel as jarring of a transition. There's evidence to suggest that gamers, for example, have an easier time determining what's quote unquote real and what's quote unquote fake on the internet, which suggests that there is an aspect of like digital literacy that you learn by spending a lot of time in these things. And that's more about fake news and about meaning. But I think at the same time, it suggests that like, well, as we're all collectively getting more literate, essentially, in the experience of living digitally, we're probably just going to feel a lot more comfortable, like comfort level, but also potentially because of that literacy, able to extract what we find meaningful about our real experiences from those digital experiences.
I still think people want to lick each other.
Remind me not to visit Pittsburgh the next time I'm traveling.
So we resolved nothing. Or we have, I don't know.
Other than maybe that social distancing might apply to Mav.
Just lick other people's content for the show.
Consent, my dude. How about consent?
Okay, with consent. I'm very big on. That was my entire point was that I think that there's going to be a point where people are consenting more just because. And again, I'm being ridiculous for the show. I don't think people are really going to go lick each other. If you are planning on doing that, please don't. Also, eugenics bad. Now, what I'm saying is,
you can lick people with consent that is explicit. Yes. That is the only context where that is acceptable. What I was really getting at, and with the backlash comment is, I do wonder. Again, like I'm saying licking because I'm being silly, but like I do wonder if there's going to be a point where I mean we talked about this. We talked about this a few shows ago. Wayne's roommate Marcel, who's been on the show, he rented out a movie theater just so we could all go watch movies, and there were 20 of us there. With basically 10 different couples in each in their own row. So I got to watch a movie this summer with Wayne and with other friends of mine, and but like, are we really watching it together? No. Because like you're watching it physically together, but apart.
Well, right. Because previously, if I'd gone to the movies with 10 or 15 friends, we'd all be sitting within 15 feet, like we'd be sitting in one row. Now we're spread out across the entire movie theater. There's 20 people there. It's not that much different than being on Zoom.
Well, it doesn't like, I mean, if that was happening digitally, we would call it we would talk about the affordances of the medium, but like, which basically means what you can and cannot do in a given space changes your experience.
But like,
if you're sitting that far apart, the affordance of that experience is not the same as before. Like you can't do the like annoying thing that we always do, like, which is like elbow your, whoever's sitting next to you and be like, hey, that actor's
just like, the one person you came with. But it was great. But my point of it was just great because it was just literally, it was exciting because, oh my God, I'm in a room with people. Wow. We're like just the idea that we were in a room with people. Yeah. And I do wonder if there's going to be like, I imagine there's going to be a point where, where sometime, hopefully by this spring, I can be like, oh, wow, a dinner party and I'm not wearing a mask. That's something, But
I think that's different from the kind of hierarchical value of like real versus virtual. I think it's like we're going to start recognizing both as equally valuable but different in a way that I don't think was true, this time last year. And I think the other important thing is there were people this time last year who did understand that. Like I said, like the gamers and nerds who already have like friends around the world that they've never met in real life, because nerds are secretly, magical alchemists of experience because code and things are cool, I guess.
So anyway, I guess we've resolved sort of that. I don't know. I mean, it's open-ended questions that we don't know the answers to, just like everything we always talk about on the show. But I do think I think it's fascinating because I think it's really interesting that on some level, the weird virtual world that most nerds, to say it how Katya just did, have been experiencing for the last decade is suddenly just sort of forced on the general public. Everybody's got to do work from home. Everybody's got to do Zoom meetings. It's just what everyone's on Slack. Like people didn't even know what Slack was like 16 months ago. Right. And now, look, and if you want to be really cool, you'd be like, yeah, I remember when this was called IRC, but like, no one would know what you're talking about. But like, it's the sort of thing that I've been doing literally for decades. And now everyone has to do that, right? The same way that everyone uses.
So you are the hipster of quarantine,
right? But what's interesting to me is like now in this world where I don't think Zoom's going away. I don't think Zoom meetings and virtual conversations like that are going away. So is the new cool thing doing, having a headset and interacting in virtual space that is not just, boxes on a screen, like essentially what Caitlyn's doing. like, is that going to be the new hipster thing where, okay, yeah, Zoom is so passe, I'm in the virtual bar now. And, like that, is that like where you're going, And I don't know. I don't know, but I kind of wonder.
Yeah. I think this just means we'll have to have another episode, my dude.
Caitlyn, thanks for joining us. This was great. Hey. And new stuff, which was awesome because,
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Where can people find out more about your project or just about you or whatever?
Sure. Yeah, you can find us on TivoliCloud.com. Check out our website. You can even download our platform right now if you want to hop in world and try it. You can also find us on Twitter under Tivoli
Those will be
Cloud
linked in the show
VR.
notes.
Yeah.
Katya.
As always, you can find me on Instagram and maybe Twitter. Maybe I'll start using Twitter again. I'm not sure. I have mixed feelings about Twitter, as we have talked about many episodes, at Just That Nerd Kid. And also just a general plug for, hey, the holidays are coming up. Maybe you should not do some interstate state travel and save a life because we are still in a pandemic. I know we are all over it, but unfortunately, COVID is not over us.
No licking people. Licking people is a next year thing.
Licking people like eugenics is bad unless consensual and you do not have COVID.
You're into what you're into. You can find me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram.
This took a really weird turn.
All the places. Always at Chris Maverick. You can follow the show on all the social medias at Vox Popcast. You can follow the show's blog at www.voxpopcast.com, where we talk about what we're going to be talking about next week and on future shows. We've got some really interesting stuff coming up for the holidays. If you enjoy the show, and we certainly hope you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from, and subscribe to us on YouTube. If you like and subscribe to us on YouTube, that will help us be more popular because, the YouTube show's been really fun. Like last week, we had really cool digital scoreboard that I designed for the game that we played last week. So please subscribe to us on YouTube because I need us to have more views because things actually get easier when you do. It's weird. Like and subscribe, hit bells or whatever the hell else they tell people to do. I don't know, Katya, you're the millennial. Say the thing.
Like, subscribe, and ring the bell.
Yes, thank you. Okay, do that. And do us a favor. Leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes, or even better yet, leave us a 5-star review. If you
leave us a review that says 5 stars, eugenics bad, don't lick people without consent. That makes us happy. And it's COVID times, people. We need this. I'd like to thank Maximilian of thoughtForm Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out.
I'd once again like to thank Caitlyn for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.
Oh,
This isn't real. What is real?